Imagine living in a house so narrow that two people cannot pass each other in the hallway. Now imagine choosing to live there for 15 years, purely to watch your neighbor suffer. This is the true story of Joseph Richardson and the spite house that redefined pettiness in Gilded Age New York. Manhattan in 1882 was a city transformed beyond recognition. The Gilded Age had reached its zenith, turning what had once been a modest colonial port into America's glittering capital of wealth and excess. Money flowed through the streets like water, building fortunes that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. The city was growing in every direction simultaneously, pushing northward up the island, climbing skyward with increasingly ambitious buildings, and burrowing underground with new infrastructure projects that promised to modernize urban life. The wealthy elite who dominated this transformed city fell into two distinct categories. First were the old families, descendants of Dutch settlers and colonial merchants, who had accumulated their fortunes gradually over generations. These families valued discretion, tradition, and the subtle markers of inherited status. Then came the new millionaires, men who had built empires from nothing during the explosive economic growth following the Civil War. These newcomers had conquered railroads, steel, oil, and finance, accumulating in single lifetimes what old families had taken centuries to build. Joseph Richardson belonged firmly to this second category, though he defied many stereotypes associated with newly rich industrialists. By 1882, Richardson was 69 years old and had spent decades building a railroad empire that stretched across multiple states. He understood trains, logistics, and the complex financial arrangements that made large-scale infrastructure projects possible. His wealth was substantial, placing him comfortably among New York's millionaire class. He could afford anything he wanted. What made Richardson unusual was not his wealth, but his relationship with it. While other Gilded Age millionaires built marble palaces and threw parties that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, Richardson lived with legendary frugality. He wore the same coat for years, even as it became threadbare and shabby. He walked long distances to avoid spending money on carriage fare. He scrutinized every expense, questioned every bill, and refused to waste a single penny on anything he deemed unnecessary. This behavior puzzled New York society. Wealthy men were expected to display their success through conspicuous consumption. The whole point of being rich in the Gilded Age mindset was to show everyone else how rich you were. Richardson violated these expectations completely. He had the money to live like a prince but chose to live like a miser. Newspapers wrote about his eccentricities, society matrons whispered about his worn clothing, and business associates wondered whether his fortune was real or exaggerated. But Richardson's wealth was entirely real. His railroad holdings generated substantial income, and his investments were shrewdly chosen. He was not poor, not struggling, not forced by circumstance to economize. He simply believed that spending money unnecessarily was foolish, regardless of how much money you had. This conviction ran deep, shaping every decision he made about how to live his life. Richardson owned various properties around New York, acquired as investments over the years. Among these holdings was a peculiar piece of land at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 82nd Street. The property was unusual because of its dimensions. It measured approximately 30 meters in length, but only 1.5 meters in width, 5 feet wide to be precise. It was essentially a strip, a sliver, a fragment of urban real estate that seemed to have resulted from some surveying error or odd historical division of land. To any reasonable person, this property was nearly worthless. What could you possibly build on land that was only 5 feet wide? A building needs width to be functional. Rooms need space. Hallways need clearance. Stairs need room to turn. Construction on such a narrow lot would be a nightmare, and the resulting structure would be essentially unusable. The land was too narrow for normal development, but too long to ignore completely. It sat there, an awkward remnant of Manhattan's complex property history. Richardson held on to the property because he held on to everything. Selling it would mean accepting whatever minimal price buyers might offer for such an odd parcel, and Richardson hated accepting less than he thought something was worth. So the land remained in his portfolio, generating no income, serving no purpose, but costing little to maintain. It was just there, a curiosity in his collection of real estate holdings. The situation changed dramatically in the early 1880s when a developer named Hyman Sarner purchased the lot adjacent to Richardson's narrow strip. Sarner was everything Richardson was not: young, ambitious, flashy, and confident. He represented the new breed of real estate developers who were transforming Manhattan's landscape. These men did not simply buy and hold property. They developed it aggressively, building apartment buildings and commercial structures that maximized the value of expensive urban land. Sarner had big plans for his newly acquired property. He intended to construct a luxury apartment building that would cater to wealthy New Yorkers seeking modern accommodations in an increasingly fashionable neighborhood. The building would feature large windows providing natural light and views of Lexington Avenue. It would offer the latest amenities and command premium rents. Sarner had calculated the economics carefully and was confident the project would be highly profitable. There was just one problem: Richardson's strip of land. While Sarner owned enough property to build his apartment building, Richardson's narrow lot sat directly adjacent to where Sarner planned to place his building's main facade. This created complications. If Sarner built right up to his property line, Richardson's land would sit just inches away, creating an awkward gap. Future tenants in Sarner's building would look out their windows onto a narrow strip of land they did not control. Worse, if Richardson ever decided to build something on his strip, it could block light and views from Sarner's expensive apartments. From a practical standpoint, Sarner needed to acquire Richardson's land. With control of that narrow strip, he could ensure his building had proper setback, guaranteed light and air, and no risk of future construction interfering with his tenants' enjoyment of their apartments. The strip was worth little to Richardson, but could be quite valuable to Sarner in the context of his larger development project. Sarner approached Richardson with what he considered a reasonable business proposition. He offered to purchase the narrow strip of land. Given that the property was essentially undevelopable and generated no income, Sarner expected Richardson would be happy to sell. After all, what else could Richardson possibly do with 5 feet of width? The offer Sarner made was $1,000, which he viewed as generous given the property's limitations. Richardson listened to Sarner's pitch and responded with his own figure: $5,000. This was 5 times what Sarner had offered, and Sarner was shocked. For a strip of land that could not be used for anything? $5,000 was absurd, outrageous, the demand of someone clearly trying to take advantage of the situation. Sarner had researched Richardson's reputation and knew the old man was famously tight with money. Perhaps Richardson was trying to squeeze every possible dollar from the situation, typical behavior for someone known as a miser. What happened next would prove decisive. According to contemporary accounts, Sarner did not simply reject Richardson's asking price. He became angry. He told Richardson the price was ridiculous. He pointed out that the land was worthless, that nobody could build anything on such a narrow lot, that Richardson should be grateful anyone was willing to pay anything for such an odd parcel. Sarner's tone was dismissive, condescending, treating Richardson as if he were a foolish old man trying to cheat a savvy young developer. Then, according to witnesses, Sarner made a critical error. He insulted Richardson personally, calling him a greedy old man, suggesting his miserly reputation was well-deserved, implying that Richardson was attempting to extort money from the situation. Sarner was used to getting his way through force of personality and intimidation. He had bulldozed through obstacles before, and he assumed Richardson would fold under pressure. After delivering his insult, Sarner reportedly slammed the door and left, confident that Richardson would eventually accept a lower price once he realized no one else would offer anything for such an impossible piece of property. Sarner had badly miscalculated. He had failed to understand a fundamental aspect of Richardson's character. The old railroad magnate was indeed famously frugal. He hated wasting money, but he hated being disrespected even more. Richardson had spent decades building his fortune through intelligence, hard work, and shrewd negotiation. He had earned his wealth and his position. Being dismissed as a greedy old fool by some young developer was intolerable. Richardson made a decision that would become legendary in New York real estate history. He would not sell the land to Sarner for any price. Instead, he would build on it. If Sarner thought the strip was too narrow for construction, Richardson would prove him wrong, and the resulting building would serve one purpose above all others: to make Hyman Sarner regret his insults for as long as the structure stood. Richardson hired architects and presented them with an extraordinary challenge. He wanted them to design a building that would occupy every inch of his narrow lot. The structure should be as tall as building codes and structural engineering would permit. It should be built right up to the property line, as close as legally possible to Sarner's planned apartment building. And it should be designed to maximize the blockage of light and air to Sarner's property while still technically being a habitable structure rather than just a wall. The architects were baffled. They explained the obvious problems. A building only 5 feet wide would be extraordinarily difficult to construct. The interior would be cramped to the point of absurdity. Stairs would be nearly impossible. Rooms would be so narrow that furniture placement would be a constant challenge. The structure would be expensive to build relative to any possible use it could serve. They asked Richardson to reconsider, to perhaps sell the land after all, or to simply leave it undeveloped rather than waste money on such an impractical building. Richardson was unmoved. Money was not the issue, despite his reputation for frugality. This was about principle. This was about respect. This was about showing Hyman Sarner that dismissing Joseph Richardson came with consequences. The architects were given their instructions: design the building, make it legal and structurally sound, and maximize its impact on the neighboring property. Cost was secondary. The design that emerged was architecturally fascinating and practically insane. The building would rise 4 stories, tall enough to block substantial amounts of light from Sarner's planned apartments. The facade would be solid brick, built to last generations. The structure would measure approximately 30 meters in length, following the full extent of Richardson's lot, but maintain that absurdly narrow width of just 1.5 meters throughout. The interior layout required creative solutions to basic problems. Stairs normally need a certain width to be safe and functional, but there was simply not enough width available for standard staircase design. The architects designed a tight spiral staircase that would wind upward through the center of the structure. Only one person could use these stairs at a time. If 2 people met on the staircase, one would have to retreat completely to their starting floor to let the other pass. Rooms were laid out in a linear fashion, one behind the other like train cars. The front room on each floor faced Lexington Avenue and received some natural light. The middle and rear rooms became progressively darker, relying on whatever light could filter through from front to back. Doorways between rooms had to be positioned carefully to allow passage while not wasting any of the precious width. The kitchen presented particular challenges. Standard stoves and appliances were simply too wide. The architects had to source the smallest equipment available commercially. The stove selected was a compact model designed for ships or small commercial operations, the narrowest that could still function for basic cooking. Counter space was minimal. Storage was limited to shallow cabinets that could fit within the narrow walls. Construction began in 1882, and the project immediately became a spectacle. New Yorkers were accustomed to unusual buildings, but this was something entirely different. Word spread about the crazy narrow house being built on Lexington Avenue. People came to watch the construction, marveling at the absurdity of it all. Newspapers sent reporters to document this architectural oddity. Hyman Sarner watched in growing horror as Richardson's spite house took shape. His worst fears were being realized. The structure rose directly adjacent to his property, a massive brick wall that would block the western exposure of his apartment building. Windows that he had planned to offer premium views and abundant natural light now looked directly at Richardson's wall, just inches away. The value proposition of his entire development was being destroyed before his eyes. Sarner explored legal options, but found none. Richardson was building on his own property, following all applicable codes and regulations. The structure met safety standards. It violated no setback requirements because those requirements were minimal in 1880s Manhattan. The building was technically habitable, with proper egress, basic amenities, and structural integrity. That it was also clearly designed to harm Sarner's interests was irrelevant under the law. Richardson had every right to build on his own land. Sarner tried negotiating again, this time with a more respectful approach. He offered to pay Richardson's original asking price of $5,000 if Richardson would halt construction and sell the land. Richardson refused. The price had changed, he said. It was no longer about money. Sarner had insulted him, dismissed him, treated him with contempt. Now Sarner would pay a different kind of price. The Spite House was completed in 1883. The final structure was everything Richardson had hoped for and everything Sarner had feared. It rose 4 stories of solid brick, dominating the narrow lot. The facade facing Sarner's property was largely blank, with minimal windows and no architectural flourishes. It was a wall, pure and simple, designed to block rather than beautify. But Richardson was not finished. To prove that his building was not merely a vindictive wall but a legitimate habitable structure, he announced that he and his wife would be moving in. This declaration stunned everyone. Richardson owned other properties in New York, normal houses with normal dimensions. He had no practical reason to live in this architectural nightmare. But practical reasons were not the point. Richardson wanted Sarner and everyone else to understand that this was a real building, lived in by its owner, not just a monument to spite. Life in the Spite House tested the limits of human adaptability. The main challenge was the overwhelming narrowness of every space. In a typical room, people can move around freely. Furniture can be arranged in various configurations, and there is a sense of openness. In the Spite House, rooms felt like corridors. Standing in the middle of any room, you could touch both side walls by extending your arms. The dining situation illustrated the absurdity perfectly. Richardson commissioned a custom table that measured just 45 centimeters in width, narrow enough to fit in the dining room while still allowing people to sit on either side. Richardson and his wife would sit facing each other across this tiny table, their knees nearly touching. They ate their meals in this configuration every day, a bizarre domestic scene that seemed designed to maximize discomfort. The narrow dimensions affected every daily activity. Getting dressed required careful choreography to avoid bumping into walls. Opening closets or cabinets meant stepping backward to make room for the door swing. Moving furniture was nearly impossible, so everything had to be custom-built to fit the space, and then essentially became permanent fixtures. Even hanging paintings required consideration of the limited wall space and the need to keep walkways clear. The spiral staircase presented constant challenges. It was so tight that only thin people could navigate it comfortably. Going up and down required careful foot placement on the narrow treads. Carrying anything while using the stairs was difficult. If Richardson needed something from a different floor, he often had to make multiple trips because he could not carry much while maintaining his balance on the treacherous stairs. The social implications were equally strange. The Spite House was not designed for entertaining. There was no room for guests, no dinner parties, no social gatherings, no accommodation for visitors. The Richardsons lived in isolation, their home unwelcoming by design. This was a dramatic departure from Gilded Age social norms, where wealthy families competed to host the most elaborate entertainments. Richardson chose confinement over company, solitude over society, all to maintain his revenge against Sarner. The press had a field day with the story. Reporters visited regularly, documenting life in New York's narrowest house. They interviewed Richardson, asking how he could stand living in such cramped conditions. Richardson's response became famous. He told journalists that he did not feel cramped at all because he had plenty of space in his mind. Looking toward Sarner's struggling apartment building, Richardson would smile and suggest that perhaps Sarner felt more confined than he did. This became Richardson's standard response to questions about his living situation. He reframed the narrative, suggesting that physical space was less important than mental satisfaction. He had room for his thoughts, room for his satisfaction, room for his vindication. The Spite House might be narrow in feet and inches, but it was vast in meaning and purpose. Every day he lived, there was another day of victory over the man who had disrespected him. Sarner's apartment building struggled exactly as Richardson had hoped. The units facing Richardson's wall were nearly impossible to rent. Who would pay premium rates for an apartment with windows that looked onto a brick wall just inches away? The blocked light made those rooms dark and depressing. The lack of air circulation made them stuffy. Sarner had to reduce rents dramatically on the affected units, and even then they sat vacant for long periods. The financial damage to Sarner's development was substantial. He had invested heavily in the project, counting on income from all units to justify his costs and generate profit. The Spite House had effectively destroyed the value of a significant portion of his building. His expected returns vanished, replaced by losses that mounted as vacant units generated no revenue while still requiring maintenance and taxes. Sarner tried everything he could think of to remedy the situation. He offered Richardson money to at least modify the Spite House, perhaps by adding windows that would allow light to pass through. Richardson refused. He suggested that Sarner might want to redesign his own building, perhaps adding a light well or reconfiguring apartments to minimize the impact of the blocked facade. Sarner lacked the funds for major renovations, having exhausted his capital on the original construction. The Spite House became a tourist attraction of sorts. New Yorkers would detour past Lexington Avenue and 82nd Street to see this architectural curiosity. Visitors from other cities asked to be shown the narrowest house in New York. The building appeared in guidebooks and newspaper articles. It became part of the city's folklore, a story told to illustrate the extremes to which New Yorkers would go to settle scores. Other developers learned lessons from the Sarner-Richardson conflict. The importance of securing adjacent properties before beginning construction became painfully clear. The risks of antagonizing property owners whose cooperation you might need became obvious. Real estate professionals began conducting more thorough due diligence about surrounding parcels and their owners before committing to large projects. The Spite House became a cautionary tale in business schools and real estate offices. But for Richardson personally, the Spite House represented triumph. He had been insulted and dismissed. He had been treated as if his age and reputation for frugality made him an easy mark. Sarner had assumed Richardson would fold under pressure and accept whatever terms were offered. Instead, Richardson had spent his own money to build a monument to Sarner's mistake. Every dollar invested in the Spite House was a dollar spent teaching Sarner and anyone else watching that Joseph Richardson was not to be trifled with. The question that puzzled many observers was why Richardson chose to actually live in the Spite House. Building it made a certain twisted sense as an act of revenge, but living there seemed like punishing himself as much as Sarner. The discomfort was real, the inconvenience constant, the social isolation nearly complete. Richardson could have built the structure and left it vacant, or rented it to someone else, while he continued living comfortably elsewhere. Why subject himself to such confinement? The answer seemed to lie in Richardson's particular psychology. He needed to prove the building was legitimate, not just a vindictive wall. Living there himself provided that proof beyond any doubt. It also demonstrated his commitment. Anyone could build something out of spite. Richardson was willing to alter his entire daily existence to maintain his revenge. This level of dedication made the Spite House more powerful as a symbol. It showed Sarner and everyone else exactly how serious Richardson was, how far he was willing to go, how little he cared about personal comfort when principle was at stake. Richardson also seemed to genuinely draw satisfaction from the situation. He enjoyed watching Sarner's struggles. He relished the attention from newspapers and curious visitors. He liked being known as the man who built the narrowest house in New York just to punish a neighbor. His reputation shifted from merely miserly to legendarily stubborn, and Richardson appeared to prefer the latter characterization. His wife's feelings about living in the Spite House are less documented. Contemporary accounts mention her presence, but rarely record her opinions. One can imagine she had reservations about abandoning a normal house for this architectural experiment in confinement. Yet she supported her husband's decision, sharing the narrow dining table, navigating the treacherous stairs, and enduring the social isolation. Perhaps she agreed with Richardson's principles. Perhaps she simply accepted that her husband had made up his mind, and would not be swayed. Perhaps she found her own satisfaction in the revenge. The Spite House stood as a physical manifestation of Richardson's values and priorities. His famous frugality, which seemed irrational to many, was actually part of a broader worldview that emphasized principle over comfort. Richardson did not spend money on fancy clothes or lavish entertainment because he saw those as frivolous wastes. But he willingly spent money on the Spite House because that served a purpose he valued, demonstrating that disrespect carried consequences. The Spite House was not a waste in Richardson's eyes. It was an investment in reputation, in dignity, in the social order as he understood it. The broader Gilded Age context made the Spite House possible. This was an era of weak building regulations, minimal zoning restrictions, and strong property rights. Richardson could build his narrow structure because the law gave property owners enormous freedom to develop their land as they saw fit. A few decades later, updated building codes and zoning laws would make such a structure impossible to construct. But in 1883, if you owned the land and could afford the construction, you could build your Spite House and nobody could stop you. The Spite House also reflected larger tensions in Gilded Age society. New York was being transformed by waves of development driven by aggressive young entrepreneurs like Sarner. These men saw the city as raw material to be shaped according to their vision and profit calculations. Older property owners like Richardson sometimes resisted this transformation, clinging to their holdings and their traditional ways. The clash between these groups produced conflicts that occasionally escalated into architectural warfare. The extreme wealth inequality of the era enabled spite houses and similar acts of expensive revenge. Richardson could afford to build a structure that served no practical purpose and generated no income, because his railroad fortune provided more money than he needed for normal expenses. For working-class New Yorkers struggling to afford basic housing, the idea of spending thousands of dollars on a building designed purely to annoy someone was incomprehensible. But for millionaires, money was abundant enough that it could be used as a weapon. Richardson lived in the Spite House for 14 years, from 1883 until his death in 1897. He was in his 70s when he moved in and remained there through his 80s. The physical challenges of navigating the narrow spaces and steep stairs must have increased as he aged. Yet he never moved back to a normal residence. He died having spent the final decade and a half of his life in deliberate confinement, maintaining his architectural revenge until the very end. After Richardson's death, the Spite House lost its purpose and meaning. His heirs had no interest in living there, and the building was difficult to rent given its impractical layout. It stood vacant for periods, a peculiar relic of a personal feud that no longer mattered now that one of the principals was gone. The structure remained standing until 1915, when it was finally demolished during a wave of redevelopment in the neighborhood. Hyman Sarner outlived Richardson but never fully recovered from the financial damage the Spite House inflicted on his development. His apartment building continued to struggle with vacancies and reduced rents on units affected by Richardson's wall. Sarner's reputation suffered as well. He became known as the developer who had provoked the Spite House, the man who underestimated an opponent and paid dearly for it. His career continued, but he never achieved the major success he had anticipated from the Lexington Avenue project. The intersection of Lexington Avenue and 82nd Street today shows no trace of the original drama. Modern buildings occupy the site, housing businesses and residents who know nothing of Richardson or Sarner. The neighborhood has been rebuilt multiple times since the Gilded Age, and the current structures bear no resemblance to either the Spite House or the apartment building it tormented. But the story persists in New York folklore and architectural history. The Spite House appears in books about unusual buildings, in discussions of property rights and neighbor conflicts, and in cautionary tales about the dangers of disrespecting people with resources and determination. It has become part of the city's mythology, a story that captures something essential about New York character: stubborn, vindictive, creative, and utterly committed to proving a point. Architectural historians have studied the Spite House as an extreme example of how personal conflict shapes the built environment. Cities are not just products of economic forces and planning decisions. They also reflect human emotions, feuds, and irrationality. Buildings like the Spite House remind us that architecture serves many purposes beyond shelter and function. Sometimes architecture is communication, declaration, or weapon. Legal scholars have examined the Spite House in discussions about property rights and their limits. Richardson exercised his legal rights to build on his own property, yet clearly did so in a way designed to harm his neighbor. Should the law permit such behavior? Is there a point where legitimate property development crosses into malicious interference with others' enjoyment of their property? These questions remain relevant as neighbors continue to clash over development rights and quality of life issues. The Spite House also raises interesting questions about rationality and revenge. Richardson spent substantial money building a structure he did not need, and then subjected himself to years of discomfort living in it. By any conventional measure, this was irrational behavior. The money spent on the Spite House could have been invested productively, or used to enhance Richardson's quality of life. The years spent in cramped quarters could have been spent in comfort elsewhere. Yet Richardson appeared satisfied with his choices, suggesting that revenge and vindication provided value that cannot be easily measured in financial terms. Modern psychologists might analyze Richardson's behavior through various frameworks. The Spite House could be seen as a manifestation of narcissistic injury, where perceived disrespect triggers an overwhelming need for revenge. It might be viewed through the lens of grudge-holding and inability to let go of grievances. It could be understood as an extreme form of boundary enforcement, where Richardson felt compelled to demonstrate that crossing him had severe consequences. Whatever the psychological mechanisms involved, the Spite House represents a fascinating case study in how wounded pride can drive extraordinary behavior. The economic irrationality of the Spite House becomes even more apparent when calculating the true costs. Construction expenses for a 4-story brick building in 1880s Manhattan would have been several $1,000s at minimum. The ongoing costs of maintenance, property taxes, and utilities for a building that generated no rental income added up over 14 years. Richardson's opportunity cost, the income he could have earned by investing the money elsewhere instead of building the Spite House, represented additional financial loss. The total economic damage Richardson inflicted on himself in pursuit of revenge likely exceeded what he would have gained by simply selling the land to Sarner for a reasonable price. Yet Richardson clearly viewed these costs as acceptable. His wealth was sufficient that he could absorb the expense without impacting his lifestyle or financial security. The satisfaction he derived from the revenge apparently justified the economic sacrifice. This calculation only makes sense when we understand that for someone like Richardson, money was ultimately just a tool. He had spent his life accumulating it not for the purpose of spending it on luxury, given his famously frugal nature, but rather to have options and power. Using money to punish someone who disrespected him was, in his value system, a perfectly legitimate use of his resources. The Spite House also illustrates how physical structures can embody and preserve social conflicts long after the original emotional heat has faded. Richardson's anger at Sarner was intense, but ultimately temporary, a feeling that burned hot in 1882 when the insult occurred. Yet the Spite House transformed that temporary emotion into permanent brick and mortar. The building stood for over 30 years, long outlasting Richardson's personal animosity. It became a monument not to current feeling but to historical grievance, a fossil of rage preserved in architectural form. This permanence distinguishes architectural revenge from other forms of retaliation. An angry letter can be thrown away, an insult forgotten, a lawsuit settled, but a building stands. It continues to exist and exert its effects long after the original conflict has been resolved or forgotten. The Spite House impacted Sarner's property value not just in 1883, but every year thereafter, until the structure was demolished. This extended impact makes architectural revenge particularly powerful, and from the victim's perspective, particularly difficult to escape. The Spite House represented a specific moment in urban development history, when individual property owners still had enormous power to shape their immediate environment. As cities grew and became more complex, the need for coordination and regulation increased. Modern zoning laws, building codes, setback requirements, and environmental regulations all constrain what property owners can build. These restrictions frustrate developers seeking maximum freedom, but they exist partly to prevent exactly the kind of malicious development the Spite House represented. Contemporary urban planners recognize that cities function better when development is coordinated and when individual property rights are balanced against community interests. The Spite House, which harmed not just Sarner, but arguably the entire neighborhood by creating an ugly, dysfunctional structure, illustrates why pure property rights without regulatory limits can produce suboptimal outcomes. Richardson had the legal right to build his Spite House, but that does not mean society benefited from its construction. The media coverage of the Spite House in its time reflected broader Gilded Age attitudes toward wealth and conflict. Newspapers treated the story with amusement rather than moral condemnation. Richardson was portrayed as eccentric but not villainous. Sarner was depicted as having brought his troubles upon himself through arrogance. The underlying assumption was that conflicts among millionaires were entertainment for the general public, amusing spectacles that had little relevance to ordinary people's lives. This attitude contrasts sharply with how we might view such behavior today. Modern society is more likely to see the Spite House as antisocial behavior, a waste of resources, and evidence of poor character. We have become more suspicious of the wealthy and less tolerant of displays of excess and vindictiveness. The Spite House, which was viewed as an amusing curiosity in 1883, might well be condemned as moral failure today. Yet the story continues to fascinate precisely because it reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. Most people can understand Richardson's anger at being insulted. Most can relate to the desire for revenge when disrespected. Most can appreciate the satisfaction of proving doubters wrong. The Spite House takes these common feelings to an extreme conclusion, showing us what happens when anger meets resources and determination. It is disturbing and absurd, but also somehow understandable. The legacy of the Richardson Spite House extends beyond its physical existence. It entered into New York folklore as a cautionary tale, a story told to teach lessons about pride, revenge, and the costs of conflict. Real estate professionals cited it when explaining why maintaining good relationships with neighbors mattered. Parents used it to teach children about the dangers of letting anger control behavior. It became cultural currency, a shared reference point that communicated complex ideas about human behavior through a single vivid example. The story also contributed to New York's self-image as a place where anything could happen, where the normal rules did not apply, where individuals with enough determination could remake reality to suit their vision. The Spite House was uniquely New York in its audacity, its extremity, and its complete disregard for conventional wisdom. It represented the city's simultaneous celebration of individual freedom and tolerance for antisocial behavior, its mix of innovation and dysfunction, its transformation of personal conflict into public spectacle. As the 1900s progressed and the Spite House approached demolition, it became a historical curiosity, a remnant of an earlier age with different values and assumptions. The Gilded Age excesses that had produced the Spite House gave way to progressive-era reforms, emphasizing social welfare and regulation. The extreme wealth concentration that had enabled Richardson's revenge moderated somewhat, at least temporarily. Cities became more regulated, property rights more constrained, and individual freedom to build whatever you wanted wherever you wanted increasingly circumscribed. The demolition of the Spite House in 1915 marked the end of its physical presence, but the beginning of its life as legend. Without the actual structure to visit, the story grew in the telling. Details became exaggerated, motivations simplified, the moral lessons clarified. The messy reality of two stubborn men making bad decisions became a clean narrative about pride and revenge. The Spite House transformed from historical event into parable, a story told not to record what happened, but to teach what it meant. This transformation is common with stories that capture public imagination. The actual Spite House was a specific building with particular dimensions, built by real people for complex reasons, shaped by their full life histories, and psychological makeup. The legendary Spite House is simpler and more powerful, a pure symbol of revenge stripped of complicating details. We lose historical accuracy in this process, but we gain narrative power and moral clarity. The intersection where the Spite House stood has been photographed and mapped over the decades. Historical societies maintain records of the structure. Architectural archives preserve what documentation survived. Yet these materials can only partially reconstruct what the Spite House was like to experience. How did it feel to live in those narrow rooms? What was it like to navigate those treacherous stairs daily? How did the Richardsons adapt psychologically to their confinement? These experiential dimensions are lost to history, leaving us with facts and measurements but not full understanding. What we do know with certainty is that Joseph Richardson, a wealthy man who could have lived anywhere and built anything, chose to construct the narrowest house in New York and live in it for 14 years, purely to punish a neighbor who insulted him. This fact alone captures something profound about human psychology and the strange ways that pride, revenge, and resources can combine to produce extraordinary behavior. The Spite House was real. It stood for over 3 decades, and it represented what happened when Gilded Age money met Gilded Age pride on a narrow strip of Manhattan real estate. The Spite House ultimately demonstrated that victory in conflicts is not always worth the cost. Richardson won his battle with Sarner. The Spite House punished Sarner financially and proved that dismissing Richardson had been a mistake. But Richardson spent his final years in cramped quarters, isolated socially, living daily with the physical discomfort his revenge required. Sarner suffered losses, but so did Richardson. The spite was mutual, the damage reciprocal, the vindication hollow. This might be the deepest lesson of the Spite House story. Revenge is expensive, not just financially but emotionally and physically. The satisfaction of punishing your enemies comes with costs that may not be apparent until years have passed. Richardson built his monument to spite and lived in it until he died, proving his point but sacrificing his comfort. Whether that trade was worthwhile only Richardson could say, and he took his answer to the grave. The Richardson Spite House, narrowest house in New York, monument to revenge, architectural absurdity, and symbol of Gilded Age excess, stood for 32 years before finally being demolished. The building is gone. The principles are long dead. The specific insult that triggered the construction has been forgotten. But the story remains, passed down through generations, retold in books and articles, cited in discussions of property rights and human behavior. The Spite House endures not as brick, but as legend, a permanent fixture in the landscape of New York mythology and American architectural history.